Good evening, everyone. I love the hubbub. We're all having a good time, and we're going to continue to have a good time together. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us in person and by Zoom. Usually at the podium welcoming everyone is Kate Markert, the Executive Director of Hillwood. She sends her regrets that she cannot be with us tonight. She and other Hillwood staff are in Palm Beach with a Palm Beach Friends of Hillwood event. Exactly. But we sort of have a little Palm Beach tonight, don't we? It's kind of nice out there. I am in her stead. I will do my best to carry her good wishes forward. I'm Audra Kelly, Director of Interpretation at Hillwood, and I am delighted to welcome you all to tonight. As we begin, I would like to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the Nacotchtank, also documented as the Anacostan, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey, the native peoples on whose ancestral lands Hillwood stands, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their homes near us today. We are so pleased to have audiences joining us for tonight's program from here in the theater, where we are, as well as many of you who are attending remotely. I welcome everyone. And for those of us who are joining us via Zoom, please make yourself comfortable. Your cameras and microphones are off, and you can start submitting, yes, it is good to know that, right? You can start submitting questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom menu when they cross your mind. At the end, after our speaker has finished talking, we will have a Q&A session, and we'll take questions from both in here and well as from the Zoom. For those of you who are in the theater, this is my mention to please take those devices out if you haven't already and silence them for us. Thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate your cooperation. Our current exhibition on view is Determined Women, Collectors, Artists, and Designers at Hillwood, which explores the innovative and intrepid women represented in Hillwood's collection. These women set an example for post and future women by making a place for themselves and overcoming obstacles through their determination to succeed. I hope you mark your calendars for March 29th. Oh, there was one of those little notices. There we go. We had our little bing. This is the get all those little those rings out now. Mark your calendars for March 29th. We are going to have a wonderful talk with curators Wilfred Zeisler and Megan Martinelli, and Head of Archives and Special Collections, Jason Speck. They will give an overview of the exhibition and really highlight some of its exceptionality. I hope you'll mark your calendars now. Tonight's lecture is part of a month-long series of Great Homes and Gardens lecture series. Next week, March 2nd, that will be our last lecture with Alex Papachristides, presenting on the varied ways he makes space versatile to share with family and friends in his new book, The Elegant Life, Rooms That Welcome and Inspire. March is also the start of Orchid Month here at Hillwood. This month-long celebration will focus on Marjorie Merriweather Post's favorite flower and will feature workshops and talks and tours and beautiful displays throughout the estate. You can learn more about these and other Hillwood's many other rich offerings at our website, hillwoodmuseum.org. And for those of you who are not yet a Hillwood member, this is my time to invite you to join today and make the most of your benefits this season with so much new popping up and going on and all year long. Let's turn to what brings us together tonight. We are so excited to hear from Carl Dellatore, who is the author of More is More is More, today's Maximalist Interiors. Carl began his career as a textile designer and has worked extensively in shelter publications, including House and Garden, Martha Stewart Living, and House Beautiful. He is the author of the Fabric Style Book, Interior Design Masterclass, On Style, Garden Design Masterclass. Carl's sixth book, also for Rizzoli, New York, will focus on 100 of the finest contemporary interiors and will be released in the fall of 2024. Carl Dellatore currently works as a design journalist and publishing consultant within the interior and garden design communities. After tonight's lecture, concludes, please, we invite you to join us outside this theater for a book signing. More is More is More can be purchased in the museum shop right above us on the second floor. So now it's my pleasure to invite you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Carl Dellatore.
Hi. Thank you, Audra, for such a great welcome, and welcome to Hillwood this evening. Let's see. We'll start here. So, I have worked in many capacities in the design community. As Audra alluded to, I've been a textile designer. I owned a curtain and upholstery factory. I've worked for Martha Stewart and Dominique Browning at House and Garden, it goes on and on. In 2008, the recession happened, as we all know, and I suddenly found myself tasked with a reinvention. And I had a book called The Fabric Style Book, which was published by Hearst, a compilation of a column I did for House Beautiful. So I thought, what will I do next? And I had never been to formal design school. So it dawned on me that maybe a second book, but how could I also go to RISD? And that's how my first book with Rizzoli happened, Interior Design Masterclass. Instead of going to Providence, I went to 100 famous designers and asked them to teach me something about one idea in the design discipline. Rizzoli thought it was a great idea, so did I. It's been a bestseller and printed in Chinese and Russian, and I'm grateful to say that. Anyway, so I did Garden Design Masterclass next, and then this book on style with 50 young designers I think represent the next generation, and then this book, More is More is More, which I started about 2.5 years ago. When I begin these books, the photo research is sort of intensive, right? I pulled together what turned out to be for this book 900 rooms to start with that represent what I think in the last 10 years of contemporary maximalism. And what we do then is to work with I work with a photo editor and with my editor and with the book designer to distill it into what we think are the best images representing this particular idea. And there are 115 in this book. We're going to walk through some of them tonight. And the ideas that I think that are pertinent in each one of the rooms. But before any of that, I started my research about maximalism in America in the Gilded Age, and I've zeroed in on 4 ideas, 4 passages of contemporary maximalism to its contemporary genre version. And it starts with the Breakers in Newport, and I think that most everybody would acknowledge that certainly this library at the Breakers represents really the Gilded Age maximalism at its height. That fireplace was brought here to the United States from a chateau, a 16th century chateau in France, and to great expense, and installed in that library. It's still remarked as sort of a Gilded Age maximalism in a nutshell in one image. And so I began studying the mansions in Newport and thinking about how maximalism in this era ultimately transcends and shows up in contemporary maximalism. I'll talk a bit more as we move down the images. A little bit fast forward, I think you might recognize this, is the Greenbrier lobby, which was opened in 1948. And gone right out of my mind, the woman's name. Tell me. Dorothy Draper. Thank you. Yeah. I was thinking Carlton Varney, but I know he took over from her. And then, right, I needed that help. Thank you. So it's sort of this is like on a bucket list of places I haven't been here yet. I don't know if anyone here has been here. You've been here? For me, this is sort of like 1940s maximalism in that the color is really the issue, right? It's the key, and this giant color blocking of the floor, the walls. These, I often thought, I still think that the juxtaposition of red and green that Draper uses in this hotel sort of contemporized a holiday color combination of red and green in Christmas. Suddenly we thought about it in a different way in this space. Let's see. So again, audacious color. The pendulum for me swings from the Gilded Age to this, where while it's still audacious, it's not nearly as dripping in accoutrement and passementerie and all of that. It's still very impactful, obviously, but not what it was in the Gilded Age. It moves forward for me into the 60s and 70s. And there's not many images of Denning and Fourcade's work. They were the 60s and 70s, early 80s darlings of Page Rent's Architectural Digest. Mitch Owens once wrote about their decorating style as magnificent excess. And for them as a couple, working in the decorating industry, everything was covered. Every single surface had some sort of detailing, some surface finish, some passementerie, as I mentioned before, the damask-covered walls, neo-Baroque curtains. Their clients included Henry Kissinger and Oscar de la Renta. And again, they were really media darlings at the time because they'd brought back, it seemed, Gilded Age maximalism in a way. But at the same time, in the high-flying, certainly the late 70s to the high-flying 80s, these sorts of rooms were de rigueur in the design industry. As I mentioned that. And then I bring us all the way to the current early 20th, late 20th, early 21st century with Kelly Wearstler, who out in Los Angeles sort of, for me, is at the apex of romanticism, old world Hollywood, and contemporary design. And her spaces are often defined by a mix of patterns, the falling block floor, the stripes on the stairs there. And then I love how there's always organic shape in Kelly's work, and that the chairs have pleated leather, almost like the outside of shells. I did ask Kelly Wearstler to be included in this book, and she declined. But we'll leave that there. Let's see. So, more is more is more. As I mentioned, I started with 900 rooms. And this room on the title page of the book was one of the first I chose. There's a woman named Cristina Juarez. She's a public relations individual in the design industry, and this is her living room in Chelsea. And it was published in Elle Decor about 5 years ago. She no longer owns this apartment, because when I called to tell her that I was featuring it on the title page, she said, I don't live there anymore. But it really sort of, the mix of things in this space, the Flocati floor, the carpet, the taples, the mix of damask and ikat, really, for me, explained what this book was in one image. I will mention now, as I'll probably mention again, Dara Caponegro, who is mentioned here on the title page, wrote the foreword to this book. She is the creative director at Schumacher and the editor-in-chief of Frederick Magazine. And the cover of the book, which we could go back to briefly, is a Joseph Frank fabric from the 50s, and it's called Exotic Butterfly. I rarely get any say over the cover of my books. It all comes down to sales and marketing, and they put a little focus group together and they mock up covers and they bring them into a conference room and they say, who would buy this book? Which one of these books would you buy? So I just give up. I'm not going to even bother with an opinion because I'm not going to get what I want. But this book in particular, this pattern was what spoke to me in my heart about a maximalist, and I took it to Rizzoli and they said yes. I could hardly believe it, and it's not going to happen again. Anyway, I had to find out who represented it, so I began looking around, and Schumacher represents Joseph Frank's textiles. And so I went to Dara and I asked if I could use this image on the cover, this pattern, and she said yes, with two caveats. First, I would write the foreword to the book, and I said, why would I say no? And she said, second would be that you include other Schumacher patterns in the book. So as you go through the book, every title page has a Schumacher pattern. And it turned out to be really a great marriage. And she was lovely to work with. One side note, we gave her 550 words to write the foreword, and she wrote 770. And we couldn't kill one word because it was so glowing that we took a picture out of the back of the book to give her another page in the front. Anyway, that's an anecdote. So again, here we are. So I broke the book into 5 chapters because it's sort of like thinking about categories of maximalism. For me, there's color, the elements in a room, pattern, obviously, layering, and surfaces. And so I'm going to take you on a brief tour through the 5 chapters of the book and show you again some highlights of the rooms that are featured within it. And so this is, again, a Schumacher pattern that is Danridge, I think it's, or Dawnridge. It's, I forget the woman who designed it, but it's Tony Duquette's house it was pulled from, so it's called Dawnridge. So this is Stephen Gambrell. And I think about, there are a lot of people whose color sensibilities I appreciate, but Stephen's is certainly high in the realm of that. And this room is actually a client of his who had, it's an apartment in New York. The clients have a place in London, and there's a cocktail bar that they frequent there that had red and purple as the primary colors. And so they asked Stephen to interpret that room in their apartment. And this was the outcome. For me, one of the things I find most interesting is this use of certainly obviously red and purple as a color combination. I'm imagining what that kind of conversation would have been like if they hadn't really trusted Stephen, because I imagine pitching red and purple would be kind of difficult to do. But for me, what's really special about this space is that it's so reflective. Obviously, the ceiling and the walls. There's only 2 windows in this room, and they're rather small. I haven't seen the room in person, but I've seen the rest of the film. What I love is how the light is reflected around the space and ultimately feels very club-like, much like I imagine the Inspiration Room is. So on the subject of color, again, this is another room by Stephen Gambrell, and this was on the cover of Elle Decor several years back. I don't know if you saw it. It's a kitchen in Chicago. And again, I wanted to be a fly on the wall for the conversation where he tried to explain that it was going to be turquoise from floor to ceiling, and there was going to be a tumbling block pattern on the floor. But one of the things I find most interesting about this room is the pecan doors, the arched pecan doors to the right, because on the color wheel, blue and orange are complementary, and he manages to hide that in plain sight in this room. I often ask people when I share this image, how many people in the room could imagine themselves with this kitchen? It would be a lot, right? To come home to this every day and cook. But it's certainly masterful. And what I understand is that the glass tile, it's turquoise, but there are Kelly green inflected throughout, so your eye travels around the tile. Again, I would not want this to be my kitchen, but I'd certainly welcome an opportunity to cook there. Right? This is a California designer who you may know, Ken Folk. And I sort of think, if you've never seen Ken's website, it's the most theatrical website you've ever seen it from an interior designer. It's sort of really inventive, and it expresses who it is you're going to get when you hire him. It's super creative, not the standard, here's my portfolio. And when I talked, this is actually in a club. It's a private dining room within, it's the only public space in the book. But I really loved how he lacquered floor to ceiling in this grasshopper green. This metallic leather that's on the chairs is inspired. And the room itself, what we don't see on the other side, is a pool table, and that's why the room is lacquered in this shade of green. It matches the pool table. Sort of an inspired way to use color. So this next room is by a woman in Chicago named Summer Thornton. I don't know if you've heard of her, but she's really very talented. And for me, what was inspired about this first, the opalescent ceiling, is to imagine the light that refracts around that space. And the simplicity and the humility that's inherent in using a gingham in a room like this, and then to paint over the boiserie in haphazard fashion to just say, we're going to make it all this gorgeous dusted marine blue. I had not known Summer's work before this book, and someone recommended it to me that I should look at her work, and I think it's really very inspired. There's another room or two, I think just one in the slide presentation tonight of hers. Then I was coming, ready for the shock. So I was coming towards the end of the book, and I was missing maybe 4 images, and we'd already gone through the 900 pictures. And I found this editorial on Architectural Digest very close to the end of the book. This man's name is Brad Shellhammer, and this is his music room in his house upstate New York. And all of the artwork hanging on the walls are his favorite artists. So there's David Bowie, there's Cyndi Lauper, there's the Beatles. It's all posters of their work. And he has this particular fascination with Marimekko textiles, which you can see the pillows on the sofas. They show up 2 more times in his house. He has a guest bedroom that's clad floor to ceiling, upholstered in a Marimekko textile, the same one, in fact, in blue. And in another room in his house, I often wonder whether he has stock in the company, that it keeps showing up in his house over and over again. But I think this is an inspired use of red. Again, I'm not necessarily sure I could live in it. All things being considered, I'm a minimalist. I sort of think of myself as a less is more guy. But this book was a real education for me. So then I moved into the second category, and this is sort of controversial, in that I think singular elements can definitely be maximalist, and people say, and I'm going to take you through some of them, but I don't necessarily think contemporary maximalism has to be defined by over the top, although you'll disagree, right? We were having a chat before the conversation. I think that singular elements in a room can make it maximal, and certainly, this is Alexander Doherty, who's a designer in New York, and this is his living room. And the element here, obviously this room is maximalist in that it's fairly well populated with different ideas, but his art collection is what drives this room in a maximalist way. So obviously we've seen many gallery walls, but this is all his personal work that moves twice a year. And I said, Alexander, how does that happen? He said, well, we come in and patch the walls, and we take everything down, and then we move it around, and the new pieces come in and old pieces come out. And I thought that's sort of an inspired way too, because you would think this room might ultimately become static. But if you change the artwork, and obviously he changes furniture pieces around as well. I also happen to love these grasshopper green chairs. Okay. Right. So this is another woman I didn't know named Carrie Warman. She's in Kentucky. And there's a photographer named Reed Rolls who's a friend of mine. And when I start these books, I often reach out to photographers because I have relationships with most of them by now and say, what have you shot lately that's really interesting? And Reed sent me the film for this project. And I was in love with it. You know, it's sort of amazing to me that this is a Gaetano Pesce sculpture sitting on the floor center in a standard Tudor entryway, and then to have the juxtaposition of the taxidermy against this foot. I mean, you walk into this room and into this house, and you immediately know what you're going to get. There's going to be some wit, there's going to be some fun, right? To place that foot in the middle of the entryway. And this really sort of speaks to that idea that a singular element in a room can make it maximal, because this is an unexpected walk in and suddenly you have a maximalist moment that isn't the Gilded Age mansion. Some of you may recognize this room. It's Bunny Williams' bedroom in New York City in her new apartment. It was recently published in Architectural Digest. And back when I started Interior Design Masterclass, Alexa Hampton has been a friend since she was a young lady, and we talked about that book, and she said, you really need to meet with Bunny, who I knew sort of professionally, but not well. She will give you lots of ideas about this book, and she was so generous with her time and spirit about how to move into the publishing industry. Anyway, we began talking about this bed, which has been in every one of her apartments in New York. It's a 1940s bed, Serge Roche, Parisian designer who created it. It's all mirrored, antique mirror, and she has taken it from one apartment to the next. And in her bedroom, she explained to me, in this bedroom, it's sort of the singular element that everybody talks about, and so she pays deference to it by creating this patterned floor, stenciled floor that's sort of muted in gray. There's gray chintz. There's a very soft pink, and then Le Singe embroidery backdrop at the headboard. But this sort of, I think, again, as an element in an interior, this bed carries the room. And then this is a woman named Denise McGahey. She's in Dallas, Texas. And I saw this room several years back and was astonished by the use of plaster block on the ceiling. So she explained that during construction there had to be, as I'm sure some of you would probably note, lots of infrastructure in the roof that was going to hold the weight of these plaster blocks that were going to go up in pattern and then they were all pre-painted and put together. There are lights, which I don't necessarily know that you can see there, but there are lights within it that when they go on in the evening, the room has a completely different feel. I've seen a picture of it, but I didn't add one here. What I like about this is when a decorative element is maximalist, like this ceiling, or like that Gaetano Pesce sculpture in the middle of the room, I like when the designer decides to make the rest of the room sort of recess a bit, right, so that it can be the star. And the furnishings obviously here are not maximalist, but it gives you an opportunity to really appreciate that element on the ceiling. So this is Jamie Drake's apartment in New York City, of Drake Anderson. You may have seen this also published. It was in Architectural Digest. The element in this room that I think so fascinating is the column directly in the center of the room. It's an architectural column that he built out four-sided, as what's on the other side are bookcases. The side we can't see closest to the kitchen is a bar. And then the TV, which has that sort of Grecian marble sculpture, looks like artwork in it. I'll tell you an interesting story about that. When we get a picture for a book at Rizzoli, two things can never happen: a television or a toilet. Never. Don't bring it to me, Carl. So what we had to do here was get a artwork photoshopped across the screen of the television, which I should point out is right there, right? And so we were able to put this room. I just thought it was an inspired way to use a structural column to camouflage it and make it function. And then it becomes this element in the space. I have been in this apartment. It's an Annabelle Seldorf building, I believe is the architect. And if you've there's a car elevator, so every floor of this apartment building has an elevator that your car lives on that can take you directly to the ground floor. And what you don't see it here, but Jamie has a cobalt blue Rolls Royce parked on the and it's part of the apartment. You walk through and oh, there's the car. Interesting. And let's see where we're going next. So, next is pattern. And so obviously maximalist interiors can be driven by patterns, and you'll see that as we go through this. But I think it's curious that sometimes you see a Lacroix runway, like we see here, from the 80s or 90s, and this is a dining room by Summer Thornton. What I think is curious about mixing patterns is of course, there are probably many more ways, but I think a motif, in this case botanical, because every pattern in the room is some way related to a flower. They can be driven by color stories. They can be driven by geographic locations. You might have patterns that are all Chinese, or you might even find a room that's sort of the grand tour, where there's a Chinese textile and a French textile. And I love how designers mix them together. Right? So this is David Kaihai, who's Miles Redd's business partner. And the story goes, this is a very small apartment. I've not been there. In the East Village, it's David's, Miles's partner's home. And when he saw the apartment, they walked in, and this is the entrance hallway with all of the doors that lead to closets, the coat closet, and there is a laundry room towards the end of it, and they were perplexed David was perplexed and his wife, and they were trying to come up with a solution. So this tumbling block pattern they put on the floor first, and then realized the way to unify this space was to take the pattern throughout unilaterally. And for me, of course, I've not been there, but I can only imagine how kinetic this feels to walk into this space. I mean, vertigo-inducing, perhaps. I might go as far as to say that if David wasn't in the room. But exciting, right? It's really exciting, this space. Let's see. So this is Markham Roberts. I'm going to get through my notes. It's a house in Nantucket. And I think of Markham Roberts as sort of the quintessential American decorator, and I think this room sort of speaks to that idea. He is heavily influenced, I'm sure you'll not be surprised, by Mario Botta and his work from the 80s and 90s, as you see that here, this mix of pattern. But the way he unifies this space is in the shades of blue. I also have a curious anecdote about this space. This quilt, which I'll point out here, is actually not an antique, it's brand new. So, and this is the story. So Markham works with an upholstery workroom in New York called Anthony Lawrence Belfair. And they bought 4 textiles, and they tea-stained some of them, and they laundered several of them several times. And then they created this pattern, this quilt. It took 6 months to make this bed covering. And I just kept scratching my head saying, you couldn't find that at a thrift shop? Really? Anyway, it's a remarkable, the project was published in Architectural Digest, and if you should want to see the rest of it, it's worth seeing. It's sort of Nantucket on steroids, I suppose, but really beautiful. And this is a friend of mine named Katie Curtis. And there's a curious story about the wife of the couple really favored purple, and the husband did not. And so there was sort of the conversation about how they were going to incorporate purple in the master bedroom in a way that would make them both happy. And I think the curious solution, this is a custom wallpaper. It's Ixel, I-K-S-E-L is the name of the company, and the scale has been blown way out to this large repeat on the walls. And for me, I don't know if you see it that way, but when she was explaining that this was the way to create a masculine air to a floral pattern, to overscale it, to make it muscular in a way. And I think it's successful. Also, they grayed down it was a brighter shade of purple, they grayed it down a bit. I also happen to like how she mixes the pattern of the curtain textile and the ottoman in the front in a way that sort of sings. Again, I don't necessarily know I'd want to have a purple bedroom. It sort of would be a lot. But I think this is an inspired use of pattern and the way to manipulate a pattern in a way that could create something that doesn't speak to the original concept. So a floral that doesn't necessarily show up as dainty and delicate. And then there's this room, which you may have seen before. Mark D. Sykes, I always have to put in the D, he corrects me when I don't, is a Los Angeles-based designer. And this was in Kips Bay, Dallas, the show house several years ago. It is his interpretation of the Côte d'Azur home La Fiorentina, the famous chateau, what am I thinking? Villa, excuse me. Anyway, Mark has a fascination with blue. Almost all his interiors are driven by blue, although he has seemed to branch out to green and red recently. I loved the way this wallpaper, which they took an architectural drawing of the room and had this wallpaper printed in 3 weeks to fit the elevations so that it all looked as if it was inlaid tile. Kind of a, I don't know, show houses, I always think, designers say they get 4 or 6 weeks. They see the room, they get the elevations, they have 4 to 6 weeks to pull it off. And when you see something this masterful happen, as most of them are, really, it's rare you see one that isn't. But this room looks as though it had always been there. And in fact, it was a show house that went in for 3 weeks and came back out. And I love the use of brown furniture. Thomas Jane, the New York decorator, once told me, buy boatloads of brown furniture now, it's going to come back. And I don't know if it has, but anyway. It's a great space. Then we move on to the third or fourth category in the book, in layering. And many people argue that layering is the easiest tool in the toolbox in getting towards a maximalist interior, because the more space, the more depth, the more objects that are in juxtaposition to each other, the more layered a space becomes. This is a cut velvet, the pattern in the background, from Schumacher. That's one of my favorite textiles. I'll just add that. He's in the back. This is Don Love, who's right there with the glasses, and his partner Pamela Black. And I'll tell you a story about this. It was published in Trad Home or Veranda? Veranda, right. So I have this thing when I put books together that I was talking about earlier, and I like to find 5 designers who may not be on the national stage or may not show up regularly, not on the AD 100, whose work I think is really exemplary. And I was looking through Veranda online, and I saw this image, and it speaks to me as quintessential layering, right? And there's something else I'll remark about this room, and this isn't me buttering your toast, Don, it's the truth. I think the secret sauce to good decorating is when a space looks as though it was collected over time versus the roof came off, everything landed, and the roof went back on, right? So this room, while I know Don and Pamela did a great job in putting it together, looks to me as if it's been there a very long time. And for me, that speaks to the idea of the comfort you'll feel in this space when you're invited into it. I'm quite certain the homeowners are thrilled with it. And I love the Slimarins photograph at the top, sort of as a nod to the colors, the blue that cascade throughout the space. And then this is a room by Pearson Ward. They're based in Los Angeles and in Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a famous Hollywood characters library office. And Pearson Ward as a couple, they love a William Morris print, and nothing better for me than an arts and crafts movement print. And so I love this wallpaper. But I also happen to love the juxtaposition of this pattern, the layering against the Damien Hirst pinwheel canvas that hangs on the wall. It's sort of, here we are in the late 20th, early 21st century with the canvas, and we're at 1865 on the wallpaper. And that layering creates a sense of history to this space that I find particularly interesting. I also, again, happen to love the desk and the credenza here that stands on the right. And there's a great tapestry on that club chair, which you don't see so well in this picture. This room I could live in, just in case you're making notes. And this is Brockschmidt and Coleman. They're based in New Orleans, although they have an office in New York as well. And this is Bill Brockschmidt's library in his house in New York, in his apartment in New York City. I've not been in this apartment, but I understand it's fairly expansive. And he uses this the space A, as a library, B as a dining room, and C as the music room. You see the piano to the left. The layering in this space is obviously inflected with classical notes. The artwork hanging on the wall, the patterns, the furniture is all historical. But what I think is most interesting about this space in the way of layering is that bookcase is actually a staircase that goes to the second layer, to the second story up here. And in terms of layering, I don't ever think I've seen anything more successful in how to layer one room against the next, right? And to build a bookcase that's this hidden staircase. He does explain that if you're over here towards the bottom of it, the treads are wider than they appear in this image, which I can only imagine would make it successful to climb. I think this is a remarkable room. And then to the harem. So this is Connecticut-based Patrick Millet. This is a client of his in London. And he explained to me that when he first met with them, they said they wanted to have Haute Bohemia as their living room. And that people would be shocked by the kaleidoscopic sense, that's his word, of the space. and also that they would feel as if they needed to have a drink and to sit down. And I think that all of that is inherent in this room. I don't drink, but I'd want to drink to sit down in this room. I just think it's inspired to have that sort of spanse of a cheetah printed sofa. Chutzpah, right, with a capital C. And the Venetian, the chandelier is quite something, right? Quite something. And this is another interesting space. This is Frances Merrill, and she's based in Los Angeles. Her company's called Wraith Design. You know, for me, this is sort of a magnificent mashup. That's what I refer to this room as, because there is an arts and crafts wallpaper. There's 70 inspired mirrored sideboard here and the Parson table, as well as the, oops, I should be pointing, right? This Parsons table and the coffee table are mirrored, and then there are sort of mission lamps, and then this wacky 1970s cactus lamp that's here on the side. For me, again, the mix of this, the layering of this space feels as if it's been there for a very long time. And again, I think that's the secret sauce of decorating. I'm also particularly interested in these burgundy mohair chairs with the orange welting, sort of a real zing and something to talk about as you walk into the space. And then the final category in the book is surfaces. Obviously, the floors, the ceiling, and the walls are the easiest place to have an impact in a maximalist interior. But I loved how going through these, and I would say half of the 900 pictures were focused on surfaces, this particular category, because of walls, ceilings, and floors. There's lots to talk about. But you'll see, I think I picked some fine examples for the slideshow. Again, we're back to Ken Folk. This is a dining room in San Francisco. He had the mural painter to come in to paint this forest scene around what is an octagonal space. And the floor, as you see, is inlaid unfinished wood, which lends to draw the forest into the space even further. Unfinished wood chairs drawing you further into the forest. This is a real experience, this space. I've not been in it. But this, as an octagonal space with a mural around it, I want to have dinner here. I want you all to come and have dinner here, right? And then the ceiling, the wall, you'll see the mural's been taken up above the crown molding ever so slightly to create a cove at the top of the space. Right, okay, so we're back to Brockschmidt and Coleman. Bill Coleman's yellow staircase we just looked at. This is another room by them. I should never include two images from one designer in a slideshow, I know, but I so love this space. It's actually a Gucci wallpaper, and it comes in two colorways, this pink and a mint green with the same herons. And to think about, dining rooms are theoretically supposed to spark conversation. Right, so you should want to walk in and have the room create some sort of spark, and this for me does. I also think it's really quite witty. You might giggle coming into this dining room, and it's actually quite small. I've not been in this space either, but I've seen more film of it, and it's a really diminutive dining room. So to use this brazen pattern on the wallpaper, I think was really inspired. They are also really nice people to work with producing books, Bill and Courtney. Let's see. And this is Ashley Whitaker. It's a house in Connecticut, and it's her own house. And this is in the attic. And so the ceiling's actually really quite low. And so she explained in talking to me about this space that she wanted her guests in this space to feel as if they were in a cocoon, to feel enveloped by comfort. And it's bird and thistle. It's a Brunswick pattern on the walls and the ceiling. And for me, I have not stayed in that many guest bedrooms, 24 in the course of my life, but I want to stay here. it's just in terms of using a pattern on all the surfaces of the space and then a painted floor is so successful. One of the other things I think that's really interesting in this room is that she carried the paper up and across the ceiling. There's a famous quote by Albert Hadley, and I'll butcher it, but he said, ceilings must always be considered. They're the most often overlooked space in a room. And I think that's often true. There is always a call, I think, for an off-white or a pale blue ceiling, but I think it's really always inspired when a designer takes the risk and takes a pattern up across the ceiling. Right. Okay. So this is an interesting story. This is designed by a good friend of mine named Glenn Gisler in New York. It's a duplex, a 6,500 square foot duplex in the West Village, a maisonette in what used to be the Village Nursing Home at 11th or 12th Street and Hudson. And this is an interior room, and it's 2 floors. And when the couple that bought the house engaged Glenn to decorate it, they said, "What are we going to do with this room? There's no windows. It's stuck between the kitchen, which is back. There's a door there to the kitchen, and what is the entry foyer here in the foreground." And so they were sort of lamenting the fact that it should be the dining room because it was adjacent to the kitchen, but there's no window in it, so what will we do? And so Glenn came up with the idea to create a view where a view didn't exist. And he engaged a mural painter to paint what is the Hudson River and the East River in the 17th century on the walls. I have been in this space. I can tell you it's beyond magical. You walk in and it's sort of like unbelievable. And what I think is, you'll giggle, is particularly great about this is this lesbian couple owned the house right here. He painted them into the mural, which I think is really great. And this is Andrew Brown in Alabama. And when we were talking, I saw this published as well, and I was talking about the floor, and he said that originally they had it much tighter, much more condensed pattern on the floor. But as he began to work through the rest of the textiles and the design of the apartment, they decided that they'd overscale the stencil floor. And it actually connects 2 other rooms. There's one here and one there, the master bedroom in the back. And this floor carries throughout. It's actually a fairly diminutive house. And so they took the opposite tack to create a large pattern on the floor, take it through the connecting rooms in a way that camouflages the fact that the house is actually small. Right? A brilliant idea. He's also a really talented man. Now, people ask me, I should back up and hide that from for a minute. People have asked me a lot, do I have a favorite room in the book? Because I spend all this time looking at images, and I'm often sort of remiss in remarking about what I think is my favorite room because I don't want anybody to be offended, and have one good friend and 45 not so great friends. But I think there are 2 rooms that are standouts, and this one gets honorable mention. I'll tell you the story. It is also in the Kips Bay Decorator Show House, and it's designed by a woman named Sasha Bykoff, young lady. When you get asked to create a room for a show house, this one in particular for Kips Bay, young designers are often given less desirable spaces. The butler's pantry, a small closet, something that you might not necessarily think is a premier space. And Sasha got the staircase of this Beaux-Arts mansion this year. And so she decided that she would create something that would not be forgotten, and this was never to be forgotten. It's a marriage, in her mind's eye, of the Memphis Italian design movement of the 60s and Miami Beach. And she had the wallpaper printed in 4 weeks. She had the carpet put together in 4 weeks and installed over 6 floors of a house. Now, I'll tell you an interesting story. The New York Times, of course, ran this as the lead image for the show house that year, because how could you not? There were less than happy designers in the house that year, because this thing obviously stole the show. But I think it's just a remarkable example of how design can take a space that might otherwise be undesirable and elevate it to something memorable. Of course, I would never want to live in this house, and I venture to guess who would ever want to live in this house. But nonetheless, I think it was a stellar way of taking a space that was less desirable and creating something memorable. And then, drum roll, my favorite room in the house, which may surprise you. So here was the brief. It's done by a friend of mine named Carl DeCino and his business partner Francine Monaco, and the firm's name is DeCino Monaco. It's a family's house, a young family in Tuxedo Park, and obviously it's a traditional house. The dental molding, all of that was in place, the crown molding, it was all there. And the young couple said, we want to have something that's young and vibrant in this staid traditional space. And so Carl and Francine, this crewel on this settee, all the colors in that are evidenced in vertical bands, asymmetrically placed 13 colors that wrap around the space. I did decide that I needed to see this room, and so I went on a field trip with them. It is astonishing in person to think that this maximal use of color to take vertical bands and wrap them around a space in this way is arresting when you walk in, but at the same time, calm. And so I don't want anybody to mention that I ever said this was my favorite room in the book, but if I had a venture, I guess this would be it. I certainly hope that you've enjoyed this tour through the book. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Great. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We're now going to take questions from the audience. My name is Katie, and I have the privilege to serve as the voice of our Zoom audience. For those of you in the theater, please wait for my colleague Alex. She'll give a little wave so you can see her. Please wait for her to pass you the microphone so everyone here in the theater and also at home on Zoom can hear you. Once you've asked your question, please return the microphone to Alex so she can get to all areas of the theater. So our first question will actually come from Zoom.
Okay.
Someone said, why is it that minimalism is so commonplace and accepted, but maximalism is not? Is there a bias against it?
Well, certainly minimalism is more understandable. You can feel comfort in a maximalist and a minimalist space, but overall, it's less to decipher in terms of things to look at in minimal spaces. I think the mid-century modern movement, which seemed to have a toehold in American design forever, could often be interpreted as minimalist. These days, and how this book ultimately came about is Instagram. I obviously study Instagram all the time and looking at design. And over the last few years, it seemed that designers were really creating spaces that were not only meant to live in, but to grab attention. There was some correlation between more vibrant, more enriched spaces, more maximalist design. And so it showed up more and more. And then, again, having 900 rooms to choose from obviously shows that we're in a movement of maximalism. I also think that in tough economic times, minimalism is a safer choice, right? Because if you choose to do the staircase and times are tough and you need to change it because you're tired of looking at it, it's different than a minimalist space which you might live with over time. I don't necessarily know that maximalism is in the background anymore. I think people are really taking risks in design. And I certainly hope that it continues, because while I am a minimalist, it's so much more interesting to talk about this, right?
Questions from the audience? Yes, in the front.
Do you think that maximalism has become more important or more interesting since COVID? We're in our homes a lot.
That's a very good question. I don't think there's been I don't think enough time has necessarily passed to gauge the experience of COVID has had on the design industry, specifically interiors. But I can say this much. At the very beginning of COVID, I was starting this book, and in conversations with many of the designers who contributed to this project, I asked whether, thinking intuitively, that their businesses were dropping because COVID. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. People got busier in interiors, explaining that people's disposable, or not, that's not disposable, isn't the word I'm looking for. Yeah, their disposable income. It wasn't going to be spent on a trip to Europe, or they certainly weren't going to have the beach house with their friends for the summer, and that people began to reevaluate home and comfort and place. And I think that that will certainly continue. I don't necessarily know anyone who has a designated dining room anymore, and I think that was being driven before COVID, but certainly now. People have home offices. People use different spaces in the house for different functions because people began to not be out in the marketplace working. I think it's still yet to be seen how it ultimately shakes out, how COVID affected. I do know lead times for all the designers who were in the room that struggled with lead times, and that was a big challenge because while conceiving of and preparing for an installation was one thing, getting the sub-zero, which I understand is still a backlog of 18 months or something because of the chips in China and all of that stuff. So a great question, but I don't know how, not enough time has passed for us to really know.
Any more from the audience?
There's that lady.
I have one over here.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm heading that way. Right here?
So I have two full questions.
Okay.
How does somebody who is less is more write more is more is more? And then two, how do we get the 900 room book?
Oh, yeah. So that's a funny thing. How does a less is more guy do a book on more is more is more? So, and I was having this conversation with my partner Stephen this afternoon. So the Lewis Sullivan adage, form follows function, has a spectrum. So there's at one end, there's a minimalist who takes form following function. It's a chair to sit in, and it's really not, there's no flourish. It's simple. It may have some interesting proportion and or silhouette, but by and large, it's a chair. And then there's the other end of the spectrum in forms follows function, where you have an Alex Papachristides who's speaking here next week room where everything is over the top. I am a guy 15% across the spectrum. So it's not minimal, but I'm very cautious about the idea that if there's a flourish, it means something. There's an architect named Daniel Romualdez who he and I have a very similar perspective. I came upon doing this book because while it would not be the way I would live, it was really exciting to look at, second part of the second question, the 900 rooms.
I'll pre-order it now.
Okay, yeah. And you know, there were so many rooms that were worthy in that 900 to belong in this book, but we also sort of, you know, as you can imagine, working with Rizzoli, they are very laissez-faire. They're Carl, go do your thing. But when it comes down to the final selection of rooms, we have rigorous discussions about there's too much contemporary, there's too much traditional, where is red, why is there no orange? And so we have to begin to jockey so the book fits together. If I ever do the 900 room book, I'll come back to Hillwood and we'll talk about it. Another question?
Yes.
This thing.
Back here.
Thank you so much. I am curious what's not in the book with regard to transitions, because I am definitely guilty of being a maximalist.
Okay.
But I struggle with how to make a flow between my rooms.
You know, a very good question. Back when I did interior design masterclass, one of the first designers I approached because I wanted it to be a cascade was Mario Boada. And so I met with him at the New York Design Center at 200 Lexington, and I asked him this very idea about how his rooms how did he link these rooms that were so clearly different? And if you remember Mario's work, there'd be a tea paper on the ceiling in silver with some crazy pattern of mint green and aubergine on the walls. And then how does the room next door to it seem to fit together when it's red and white? And he gave me a very curious answer. He said, it doesn't matter. And I said, really? He said, Carl, it doesn't matter if they match from one room to the next. And, I sort of, on one level, I want to argue with that perspective, right? Because ultimately, don't rooms have to fit together? We were visiting some friends this weekend who have managed to tell a color story that connects from one room to the next. I think that's an important way to do it. Metals can show up from one room to the next in a way that subliminally connects spaces together. Floor coverings that run through 2 rooms like they do in Andrew Brown's, or 3 rooms, can connect transitional spaces together. I don't know if I necessarily ascribe to the it doesn't matter, and Mario's no longer with us, so there was nobody here to argue with, but it's an excellent question. Do we have one more? Okay.
Katie, do you have
All
any
right.
more online?
We don't have any other questions on Zoom, so if there's no other questions in the audience, thank you so much for a great
Yes,
presentation.
thank you for
Why don't we
coming.
give Carl another round of applause?
I am going to sign books if you're interested. Gentle nudge. Thank you.